GSAP and ScrollTrigger are by far the most powerful tools we have for creating advanced interactions in Webflow. In this lesson, we'll recreate these interactions and cover everything you need to know, starting with the absolute basics. First, let's add the GSAP and ScrollTrigger libraries to our Webflow project. This can go in page or site settings in the before closing body tag. Let's go to gsap.com/install. Here, we'll click on the CDN tab and check ScrollTrigger. This gives us the GSAP and ScrollTrigger links that we can copy and add to Webflow. We'll be using a tool called CodeSandbox to write our code, so we can update it without having to republish our site. Let's copy the first line, add it below the others, and we'll replace this URL with a link to our CodeSandbox file. Create a free account on codesandbox.io, click Create a Sandbox, HTML, CSS, and Create Sandbox. From here, we'll create a new file using this icon, and we'll call this script.js. Let's copy the link to our CodeSandbox, and in Webflow, we'll paste it in and target our script.js file. Let's save and publish our site. The first thing we'll animate are these thumbnail images. Let's copy their class and head to CodeSandbox. We'll close this preview window and close the side panel. To animate with GSAP, let's type gsap.to. Inside the parentheses, we'll add quotes, period, and paste our class name. Behind the quotes, we'll add a comma and squiggly brackets. Inside these brackets, we can pass in any properties we want to animate. I'll pass in scale:0. Here, we're animating all our thumbnail images to a scale of 0 from whatever the scale was in Webflow. So if we save that, notice how all our images animate to scale 0. If we don't pass in a duration, the default duration in GSAP is 0.5 seconds. Let's change that to 2 seconds. We can also change our type of animation to a from animation. Here our images will animate from a scale of 0 back to whatever the scale was in Webflow. So if we refresh, notice our images animate up from a scale of 0. We can also do a from to animation, and this allows us to set the initial state. We'll add squiggly brackets and a comma. In here, we won't pass a duration, just the property. So we'll animate from a scale of 2 to a scale of 0 over a duration of 2 seconds. And if we save this, notice our images start really large and scale down to 0. And the last thing we can use is a gsap.set. This instantly sets the image to a certain style without needing to use a duration. So there'll instantly be a scale of 0 on page load using a gsap.set. We can also add multiple properties in whichever order we'd like. Let's animate with a gsap.from, from an opacity of 0, and from a border radius of 3 rem. For any property that uses 2 words, we'll delete the dash and capitalize the second word. If we use a number, this would be 3 pixels, but for a certain unit, we'll wrap it in quotes and we can add 3 rem. I'll have this happen over a duration of 1 second, and if we save with Command S, refresh our site, these fade up and the border radius opens. All animations in GSAP have a default ease of power 1 out. I'll leave a link to this ease visualizer in the description below. Each number is getting progressively stronger, and we can change the ease type here and copy it into our project. We can add it anywhere inside the squiggly brackets like so to apply a different ease. One of the coolest parts about GSAP is its ability to easily create stagger animations. Let's animate all our images from a scale of 0 and we'll stagger their start times. We'll add stagger, open and close squiggly brackets, and add a comma. Inside the brackets, we can pass in each 0.5. This will put 0.5 seconds in between the start time of each image. So our total duration is going to be 2.5 seconds, and the more images we add, the longer our animation will become. Instead of each, we can also use amount. This will distribute the start times of the images across 0.5 seconds. So no matter how many images we add, our total duration will never be longer than 1.5 seconds. Amount is great when we have a dynamic number of items we're animating. If we save this and refresh our site, we should notice they all kind of scale up and they're staggering from the first one in the list all the way to the end. We can also customize where they stagger from though. Right after amount, we'll add comma from, and in quotes, we'll pass in from the end of the list. So if we save that and refresh, it'll start at the end and stagger back to the beginning. We can also do center, so it'll stagger from the middle item, or random, so every time we refresh the page, it'll stagger in a random order. Next, let's grab a couple other elements to animate, like this title wrap. We can copy its class and create a new line in our code. We'll do a GSAP.from on our title wrap from an opacity of 0 and from a Y transform of 6 rem, so it's pushed down and it'll slide up. This can happen over a duration of 1 second. Let's also grab this large image here, our hero image. We'll copy that class and do a GSAP.from on the hero image, animate it from an opacity of 0 and from a scale of 0.8. This can happen over a duration of 2 seconds. So if we save that, we should notice now our title sliding up and this image scaling up, but these are all happening at the same time. We might want to create some kind of a sequence to our animation. So let's come back here and we'll create a GSAP timeline. So we'll say let to create our timeline and we can name it whatever we'd like. I'll call this load TL for load timeline. We'll set it equal to gsap.timeline. And then to add these steps to our timeline, all we need to do is replace GSAP with the name of our timeline. This will happen in the order we laid out here. So the second step will only start animating after the first step is completely finished. If we save that and refresh, the title comes in, then the images, then this large image. But we might want them to slightly overlap each other. So to do that, we can use a position parameter. Let's add a comma after the squiggly bracket and we can pass in a number. I'll say 0.5 seconds. So this step will happen now 0.5 seconds from the start of the entire timeline. This acts kind of like position absolute. We're just absoluting it to the beginning of the whole timeline and offsetting it by 0.5 seconds. But we can use a relative position parameter by wrapping this in quotes using a less than sign. And here we're saying let this step start at the beginning of the previous step. But we might want to offset that a little. So we'll say at the beginning of the previous step plus 0.5 seconds. We can also use a greater than sign to say let this step start at the end of the previous step, which is what it would normally do. But then we can say minus 0.5 seconds. So it cuts half a second into the previous step. For now, we'll just have it start at the beginning plus 0.5. And if we save that and we come back here, now we should notice while these are still animating, this image starts to come in. Next, let's create a new timeline. We'll call this loopTL and set it equal to gsap.timeline. We'll say loopTL.to on our hero image. Let's animate this image to a Y of -1 rem and over a duration of 1 second. And with an ease of power 1 in out, so we're using the start and end. Now, in our timeline, we can add squiggly brackets to open the settings. Let's pass in repeat 4, so our timeline repeats 4 times. If we save and refresh, we should notice this image sliding up, and then it just keeps restarting until the 4 times is over. To make this feel more smooth, though, we might need to slide our image back down to 0 before repeating. Or another way we could handle this is in our timeline settings, we can pass in yo-yo true, which means it'll play forwards and then backwards. And we can change repeat to -1, so it repeats infinite number of times. If we save and refresh, our image should start sliding up and down smoothly, and that should just keep repeating. Let's right-click on our page and click Inspect, and click on Console. For any timeline, there's different methods we can use to control it. Let's grab our loopTL and do .pause, hit enter, and it pauses the timeline. I'll hit my up arrow key, change this to .play, and it resumes the timeline. We can also do .reverse. This means on click or hover of a link, we could play, pause, or reverse our timeline, giving us a lot of control. This is one of the greatest things about timeline. And we can also do .timescale, and 1 would be its default speed, 3 would be 3 times the original speed, so we can speed it up while it's playing. There's all different methods we can use on a timeline. But here we might want our timeline to only start after the image is fully scaled up. To do that, we can pass in paused true, so the timeline is paused on page load. And then for this step here, we can pass in a callback. I'll do on complete. That means when this step is completed, we can do loopTL.play. So we'll play our timeline only after this step is completed. There's all different callbacks we can use, like on start, on reverse, reverse complete. So definitely look into those callbacks here. But the great thing about this is this looping timeline will only start after the image is fully scaled. This is great for things like page loaders or different things where we may only want the hero to animate after this preloader is finished. Next, let's animate this final section. Here we have a bunch of images stacked on top of each other. Let's copy their class and head to our code. We'll create a new timeline called ScrollTL, set to GSAP.timeline, and we'll add a step to this timeline, ScrollTL.from on our about images. We'll animate them from opacity 0, from a scale of 0.8, over a duration of 0.15, and we'll add a stagger to offset the starts of each of them by 0.4. So once we save that, if we refresh here, we should notice these images start to come in, but they started before we were scrolled into view. So we need to make sure these only animate after we're scrolled into view of this about section. So to do that, let's open our timeline settings, and I'll hit enter and pass in ScrollTrigger. ScrollTrigger accepts its own settings, the first being the trigger element. In our case, it's the about section, and the start point, it'll be when the top of that section reaches center of screen for us. The end point will be whenever the bottom of section reaches bottom of screen. And we can also pass in markers true, just so we get a visual preview of these 2 points while we're building. I'll also add scrub true, so while we're scrolling past these, we'll be scrubbing the timeline with our scroll bar. So if we save that and refresh, notice we have these nice markers now, and whenever the top of this section reaches center of screen, we're starting to scrub our timeline, and whenever the bottom of that section reaches bottom of screen, our timeline is over. Now we can also pass in percentage-based points instead of keywords like top, center, bottom. We could say when 10% from the top of the section reaches 40% from the top of the screen, and if we save and refresh, now we'll notice that this start point is 40% from top of screen, and this start point is 10% from the top of the section. Let's change our trigger points to start when top of section reaches 40% from top of screen and ends when bottom of section reaches 50% from top of screen. Instead of scrub true, we could also add a number here. That means if we abruptly stop scrolling, it'll take about 2 seconds for the animation to catch up to our scroll bar. The higher the number, the more smooth this can feel. Instead of scrub, we could also add toggle actions. This means when we scroll into view of our section, our animation will play at this duration instead of scrubbing it. For toggle actions, there's 4 points we can consider. The keywords we can use for those are play, pause, resume, reset, restart, complete, reverse, and none. So if we were to check out those 4 points, the first is when the top of section enters view, and the second point is when the bottom of section leaves view. The third point is when the bottom of section re-enters view, and then the fourth point is when the top of section exits out. So if we were to take that into consideration, let's say when this section enters view, we'll play. When it leaves from the bottom, we will pause. When it re-enters through the end, we will resume. And when it exits out past the top, we will reverse. So if we were to save that and refresh, we should notice now whenever we enter, it plays. Exit past the bottom, it would pause. Re-enter, it resumes. And then exit past the top, it reverses. So we get really granular control of what we want to happen at these 4 points. The setup I usually like to use is start whenever the top of section reaches bottom of screen, so it's just peeking in at the bottom, and ends whenever the top of section reaches whatever percent offset I want from top of screen, maybe like 70% from top of screen. And we'll just take a look at what those 4 points will look like. So if we were to save this and refresh here, we'll notice our start point is when top of section reaches bottom of screen, and for that we'll do nothing. Our endpoint is when the top of section exits past that 70% from top of screen, and for that we'll play our animation. The next point is when the top of section re-enters here, and for that we do nothing. And the last point is when the top of section goes out and is completely out of view. And for that, I would usually reset the animation so it's ready to play again when we come back in. So to see that in action, when it enters out the bottom, do nothing. When it crosses that threshold, 70% from top, we'll play. When it re-enters past that 70%, do nothing. And then when it goes out past the bottom of the screen, we will reset the animation completely. So if we save that and refresh, now we'll see that it's completely hidden until we reach that 70% mark. When we cross back past the 70% mark, we're not seeing it reverse yet. It's just waiting, and it doesn't clear out till the section's completely out of view, and then it's ready to be played again. The last thing to consider is what happens if we have multiple copies of this About section on a single page. Whenever that happens, the first section acts as a trigger, triggering all of the images. Instead, we want each section to trigger its own images. To do that, I like to use a jQuery each loop. I'll loop through all of the About sections on the site, and we can do .each, and I'll open up parentheses, create a function, open this squiggly brackets, and I'll move all this timeline code inside my each loop. So now for my trigger element, I can replace this with the keyword this, which just refers back to the section I'm looping through. And instead of animating all About images, I can grab this section and find only the child About images inside of the current section I'm looping through. When I save that and I refresh, it treats each section as its own trigger. So when this section comes into view, the images inside it play, and when the second section comes into view, the images inside that play. If you'd like to learn more about ScrollTrigger and other advanced GSAP libraries, check out my Patreon in the description below.